Well, I'm still Gene Schriefer, and I'm still in Southwest Wisconsin, so I'm not going to go through that introduction again. This second presentation today, I wanted to think about broadly the idea of matching the quality of forage that we can grow out there with different livestock requirements at different stages of their annual production cycle. So we're going to think about it in terms of just kind of those broad concepts of what we can, how we can apply some different strategies in managing our pastures. Points I wanted to cover, we're looking at changes in livestock nutritional requirements over their annual production cycle and understanding what's changing in plant physiology as that plant grows and matures. And then really, how do we've got two moving targets, and what do we do in terms of trying to graze and manage for profit? So hopefully we understand that different animals have different nutritional needs. A dairy cow is not a beef cow. They produce significantly more milk, which takes a lot more energy. A mature animal is not a growing animal, and those have different protein and energy requirements. Can we meet the needs of a lactating cow or a growing animal on pasture? In most cases, yes, we can. Forage can be extremely high quality, depending on what type of production levels we're trying to meet. Can we meet the needs of all these different critters on the same pasture? And that's where I would argue probably not. We need to learn to grow and manage different pasture for different classes of animals. The main drivers of nutrient differences are on the class of animals. Here, I'll try not to drive everybody crazy with my laser pointer. So the class of animals. Mature animals require lower nutrition than growing animals. Their growing animals are putting on frame and everything else. Stage of production, a dry cow needs less nutrients than a late gestation cow, needs less nutrients than that lactating cow. Body condition score, severely emaciated, the Goldilocks, the one that's just right in the middle, or the morbidly obese, all have different nutrient requirements. Milk potential. Milk is an energy source. Low milk potential cows eat less groceries than a medium milk potential cow, or less than a high milk potential cow. And weather, and what's the hair coat and where's thermal neutral impacts the level of nutrients that they're going to need to intake. And we touched on this a little bit, but we'll touch on a little bit more this time around. And while I'm often focusing on beef, please recognize that the principles hold true for sheep, goats, dairy animals, whether they're dry or lactating or body condition score, growing, mature, the principles are all identical in what's going on. As we think about growing animals, all growing animals are going to pass through three phases from birth to maturity. The first thing that a growing lamb or a growing calf is putting its energy into is growing frame size, developing that skeletal structure. So that's the first area that most of our energy is growing into. And we see, I was just looking at some ewes last night, or some ewe lambs last night. And it's like, wow, that one's almost as tall as her mom. Now, she doesn't look like a mature one. She's got a lot more growing to do, but from a frame standpoint, she's almost at her mature size. After we've developed bone, then we start to put on muscle. And muscle is interesting. We don't grow muscle. We grow muscle fiber. So on the date that a calf is born, or a lamb is born, or you or I even are born, we are born with a full set of muscle cells. There is no cell division for muscle cells. As we grow and develop larger muscles, it's really an increase of fiber enlargement and the fiber numbers between those muscle cells. And then, so we're adding muscle mass as that second phase. And then as we start to approach a mature phase, we start to deposit a little bit more fat, and that's the last thing that the animals begin growing muscle or fat tissue as they approach maturity. Usually that's not going to begin until they're probably 60% or more of their mature size that will begin depositing fat into intermuscular fat or subcutaneous fat. And the big if we have energy in excess of their daily maintenance requirement. When we think about finishing animals, finishing is a description of the level of fat that's been deposited either subcutaneously and intermuscularly. So this is where we come up with our meat quality grades of select, choice, or prime. It's a measure of fat deposition. Now, these different growth phases, frame, muscle, fat, have different levels of protein and energy. So in general, protein requirements are highest in our youngest animals and decrease with age and growth, and energy requirements are lowest with our youngest animals and increase with age and growth. And this should make perfect sense. What is fat? It's stored energy. Where it's where it's a reserve energy account, so that if I need energy later and there's not enough nutrients out there, I can live off the fat of my back, right? This was a biological adaptation from evolution, so that when we had times of plenty, when we have spring grass, summer grass, the animals can deposit fat. And we have times of lean in the winter and there's snow and nothing green and growing, the animal can live off those fat reserves and make it to the following spring. This is why in nature, everything mostly calves or gives birth in the spring, in that time of plenty, right? Everything's birthing at that time of year. And if you're a predator, when do you whelp? In spring. Why? Because there's a food source, because everything else is birthing. And we can get after birth, we can get those young vulnerable animals. It's all about energy. Most of our pastures are almost always adequate or high in protein, and they're very low in energy. This is one of the challenges that folks that are trying to produce finished lamb or finished cattle on pasture is that there's an energy deficit. So what happens? It takes more days to get to that finishing phase. And if we think about a feedlot and we're feeding grain or corn or small grains, that's energy, right? That's why we feed it. It's high in energy and low in protein, exactly what that finishing animal needs. Now, can we produce and graze higher energy forages? Absolutely. Is it the same pasture as our cows are getting? It might be, but it's probably going to be a different pasture if we want to get higher rates of gain and get shorter days to finish. So a dry versus a lactating beef animal, what happens between these two? We're going to consider a 1,200-pound beef cow with moderate milk production potential. When she goes from dry to producing milk to feed her calf, her intake increases by 50%. That's a lot to go up 50%. Could you eat, half again as much every day? That's a large thing to think about. When we look at crude protein requirements in total pounds of crude protein per day increases by 100%. Need twice as much crude protein than when they did when they were dry. So now let's think about 100%, but we can only add 50% more intake. So if we're grazing the same forage and it was adequate, we can increase it by 50%, we're going to wind up with a protein deficit if we don't change the quality of the forage. So we need higher quality forage for lactating animals because they can only increase by 50, but they've got 100% more intake on their protein requirements. Energy requirements, again, going up by 87%. If we're feeding the same forage as we did and only increased by 57 or by 50%, we still need better energy forages to meet that higher requirement of lactation while they're producing milk. So milk potential impacts intake, protein, and energy. And low milk potential cows need fewer pounds of crude protein, fewer pounds or millicalories of energy. Medium milk potential need more. And of course, high milk potential cows certainly need the most nutrition. Now, here's the rub. Even when those low, medium, high milk potential cows are dry, they still need proportionately more pounds of protein, millicalories of energy to sustain themselves. They have larger organs, they have larger blood supplies. It takes more maintenance to keep that high milk potential cow going year round. So, my opinion is we only need as much milk as a calf can utilize or as a lamb can utilize. Anything that we're producing that they can't utilize in terms of that cow, we might be spending more money that we may not have to. I don't know that we need as much emphasis on milk in the beef industry as some producers seem to like to push for. And that's an opinion. So that's how I think about our herd and what we're doing. Body condition score, still working with a 1,200-pound cow. It takes about 80 pounds to move from one body condition score to another. A condition score 5 is what we consider average. That's our 1,200-pound rate. It takes about 184 millicalories of energy on a daily basis to have enough excess calorie or enough calories to meet her maintenance requirements. So this is actually kind of an inverse relationship. So the lower the body condition score as we move from average to thinner, our millicals to maintain that are actually decreasing. So it should be easier to put weight on as we look at these lower body condition score cows, because they're going to put that excess energy into putting on more muscle, putting or growing those muscle fibers back and adding some fat. As we look at these obese cows, it's taking her 290 millicalories a day to sustain that level of obesity. We are grossly overfeeding her that we could better put into some other cattle, some stocker cattle, some thinner cattle. We need to put her on a diet somehow because that's just too much energy. This is also when we think about finishing cattle, as we move from that last phase, from that stocker grower phase of 800-900 pounds into that finishing phase of 1,000, 12, 1,300 pounds, it's taking more and more energy to put fat on to get them to that finishing stage. So when we think about grass fed or grass feeding, if you've got clients interested in that, we don't want to get too far past that high select and low choice, because it's going to take more and more forage that we could probably better utilize from a profit standpoint on some lighter growing animals and getting up to that bottom rung, rather than trying to push them into that high choice or maybe that prime area. Ideally, try and stay within that 4 to 6%, 4 to 6 body condition score rating. If we're calving at a 4 or 5, we're probably fine. If we've got good quality pasture, or a 6, probably going to slow down on feeding, maybe a little bit lower quality hay or maybe a little bit lower quality pasture. A cow should have a little bit of variation over the course of the year. We don't want to keep her at a 6 year round. That's just not how they evolved. Losing a little weight, putting a little weight back on is perfectly fine. We just don't want to slip down into the 1, 2s, and 3s, and we don't want to push them up into those 7, 8s, or 9s. So if we see large changes, we need to re-examine what we're doing, that we're either not providing an adequate amount of forage, or the quality of forage that we're providing is too low, or maybe too good if we're seeing these cattle get too fat, especially if we're doing that before breeding. Referenced this earlier, don't need to spend a whole lot of more time on this. College students spend an entire semester learning about, or more than an entire semester, learning about nutritional requirements of species. It's I mean, to think that we're going to cover this in 30 or 40 minutes is pretty unrealistic. Unless you're a nutritionist, you probably don't need to have this committed to memory. We can look it up. All of this is online. The charts, the tables are all online. What we need to know is what's the broad terms of what's needed for protein and energy, and understanding what those changes are. And hopefully, earlier I've communicated that nutrition changes over time, but forage also changes over time as well. So if we think about what happens with cool season grass growth over time, um, our forage quality decreases as that plant matures, but as that plant is losing quality, we are increasing in forage yield. Initially, the plant is using carbohydrates, it's using energy to produce more leaf. And as it gets more leaves, eventually it's able to photosynthesize and start to recharge its carbohydrate reserves. And we see that initially decline, and then eventually it starts to increase again. Now, this particular chart is looking at spring of the year. Our cool season grasses mostly head out only once a year. The only exception I can think of is Timothy heads out every time it grows. There might be a few others, but orchard grass, meadow fescue, brome grass, bluegrass only head out a single time of the year. The rest of the year, they remain vegetative, right? So after our spring flush, we don't worry too much about seed head production. But what's happening is we're growing leaves, we're growing leaves, we're growing leaves. And at some point on this growth curve, the flag leaf emerges. And the flag leaf is that last leaf before the seed head starts to come up through that sheath. And we can actually feel that seed head if we get out there and feel on the stem. And what we're getting now is entirely stem elongation with no new leaves. So this is when we start to see forage quality really start to decline. And when we see that flag leaf, that's probably time to think about grazing that off, because mostly what we're getting at this point is stem material. So our goal really is to try and keep that as vegetative as possible in the spring, and avoid that going into that reproductive phase when our forage quality has really declined. So the manager's decision is, at what point should I be grazing? Am I interested primarily in quality, or am I interested more in forage yield, and I can use a little bit lower quality and get a lot more tonnage out there? And this really is kind of this art of grazing, of figuring out where's that best part of that growth curve that we most want to be at it. Quantity, quality, or a balance between those, or is it maybe highest energy? What's happening in the plant cells is mostly occurring in the cell wall and the cell inside the cell itself. Most of the goodies that ruminant animals are using are inside the cell wall. The protein, the carbohydrates, the sugars, the starches. The cell wall is where the fiber is. That's what gives the plant rigidity, what gives the plant structure. And the number that we talk about is total digestible nutrients, and it's a measure of the digestibility of the forage. Now, the higher the TDN number, that means the better the energy value for that plant is. With maturity and that plant cell wall getting thicker, what's happening is the plant is depositing lignin, and lignin is indigestible. Livestock can't digest lignin. The other component of that cell wall is fiber. And this is primarily hemicellulose and cellulose. These are structural carbohydrates that rumen bacteria can break down. So it is digestible, and this is where they can pull energy out of that plant. So what's happening over time is older plants are putting down higher percentages of lignin, which is decreasing their level of digestibility. which impacts how quickly the rumen bacteria can break that down and pass it out through the digestive system. And so the more digestible, the less lignin, the greater the intake, and so the faster that they can process fibrous material, the better the rate of the gain, the better the rate of gain, or the more milk per acre that we're having. When we look at new leaves, newly emerged leaves, we're seeing those as being in the 70 to 75% digestible. We look at older leaves, that's dropping down to 60 to 65. Dead leaves, 45 to 50%. Green stems are still 50%, but dead stems dropping all the way down to 35% digestibility. As we're moving down this digestibility, we're losing energy and we are slowing down the rate of pasturage, which means that they can graze less pounds on a per head per day basis. So when we think about getting high levels of intake to maintain high rates of gain on pasture or high amounts of milk on pasture, we really want to be thinking about how we can be grazing up at this level. And if we've got all new leaves or new leaves and maybe dead, a little bit of old leaves, but not a lot of old leaves and no dead leaves, that's going to be a high producing type of pasture. So the message here is that the type of fiber matters and the digestibility of that fiber is really important. So in spring, if we can keep that vegetative, we're going to optimize our forage quality and improve dry matter intake. When we think about the growth of our cool season grasses, most cool season grasses only ever have 3 growing leaves at any one particular point in time. By the time that 4th leaf emerges, that first leaf is starting to senesce or die back. And so by the time we've got that 3rd leaf emerged, that's the point when that plant has fully recovered. Now, we might graze it right at that point. We might graze it right before. We might graze that a little bit after. But what's happening here, and we can see this in this graphic, is we've got our residual leaf here left behind from our last grazing. We get a new leaf that's fully emerged, and we've got our second growing leaf starting to appear. So this is a 1-leaf stage. Here we've got our first and second leaf fully emerged, and the 3rd leaf is starting to come up. This is our 2-leaf stage. And finally, as we've got our first, second, and 3rd leaf fully emerged, we've got a 4th leaf starting to emerge, and our residual leaf, which was here, is already dead, and that's an old leaf, and that's the one that's starting to die and lose a lot of digestibility. Now, one final point to make here is that forage quality is a function of plant maturity. So how well recovered that plant is. Tonnage or yield of the plant is a function of fertility, moisture, and variety. So we could have a plant that is 6 inches tall, have 3 leaves fully emerged, and it is fully recovered if fertility or moisture might be limiting factors. We could also have a plant that might have 2 leaves that are 14 inches tall and the 3rd leaf still hasn't emerged. That hasn't fully recovered yet. So tonnage relates to fertility and species, the variety and then the level of moisture. Quality is a stage of development factor as far as quality of that forage. So the challenge then again for the grazing managers is putting all these pieces of the puzzle together. We've got changing livestock requirements. We've got changing forage quality. We're looking at gain per acre. We're talking about average daily gains. Should we graze more days of the year? How does stocking rate put that together? And this is really the heart and soul of what grazing planners help producers think through. And that's like, how do we manage these 2 moving parts? So if you have a producer that comes in and says, I want to maximize my average daily gain, have them put 1 steer on 10 acres. They're going to make great gains. That animal is going to be able to graze the best quality feed every day, and it will gain extremely well. I'm not sure they're going to make a land payment doing that, but they will gain a very good, 2.5, 3 pounds of day gain. And they can talk about that down the coffee shop. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the producer that says, I want to maximize my gain per acre. Well, then stock it very heavy, reduce selection. We might wind up with very low individual animal performance, but our total pounds of gain per acre will be very high. And we've got this teeter totter, right? Where's that best spot to be? Where's that optimum rate between low stocking, high average daily gains, and low average daily gains? And this is that management decision. So when we have light stocking and high selection, high average daily gains. Heavy stocking, low selection maximizes our gain per acre. Can we have heavy stocking and high selection? Um, yeah, we can. This is the premise behind adaptive multi-paddock grazing systems, which is using really high stock densities, packing a whole lot of animals into a small area, but then moving them 4, 5, or 6 times per day, which enables them to have a high degree of selection. Now, this comes with a significant labor cost that I don't find a lot of producers are willing to put in, but there may be some, and there are some that are doing it and they're satisfied with it, but it kind of gets at the best of both worlds. The other thing that we need to think about here is again this idea of supplemental feed on pasture. Is it all grass, or is it grass and something else? So, livestock producers have this crazy of notion that they should have some profit somehow, and finding that optimum is really our job, their job, to know what's that best point on that forage growth curve and that stocking rates to achieve that idea of profit. I'm in Wisconsin. We've got all these dairy. Well, we used to have all these dairy producers. We've lost a lot of dairy producers, but a lot of them go to beef, and they really like to grow high quality forage, which in my opinion, a beef cow will never turn their nose up at very high quality forage. She just doesn't need it. So growing the right quality forage for me has always been a challenge as I work with retired dairy producers. Um, I don't know if any of you work in the sheep industry at all, but Dan Moracle was the sheep specialist for Iowa State University. I met him years ago. He's now retired. And he said, Gene, and because I was a sheep producer, you can't overfeed your sheep and make money, and you can't underfeed your sheep and make money. You just have to feed them right, which, as I think about it, probably wasn't all that profound, but it certainly impressed me at the time. But there's not money in overfeeding sheep, and there's not money in underfeeding sheep. So it is true, but we also need to know that ruminant livestock can't utilize over 17% crude protein in their diet, and in many cases, our pastures are well in excess of that. I mean, an average pasture is going to be 20% crude protein. A high quality pasture is going to be in the mid 20s if we've got a lot of clover out there. So we have to be aware of crude protein in their diet. And if it's over that, they have to excrete this from their system. They can't run around with excess protein in their bloodstream. Most dairy producers do milk testing, and they get some pieces of information back. One is called an MUN or MUN level. It's a milk urea nitrogen, and it's a measure of how much extra protein is showing up in the milk. They can also do a blood analysis for a BUN or BUN, which is blood urea nitrogen. And when we see these levels become elevated, we know we're getting too much protein in the diet. Beef producers, sheep producers don't do that, but we do know that they can't utilize excess protein in it. The problem is it takes energy in order to get that out of the system. And what did we decide earlier? That pasture is a high protein, low energy forage. And now we're asking that animal that's just taken in some very high quality and a protein standpoint pasture to excrete that in their urine, and they have to do that with energy. And that's either energy from pasture, or that's energy off the fat of their back, or it could be some supplemental energy in terms of a feed supplement that we've got on pasture. So Fat cows may not be profitable. They may have a harder time calving and a harder time rebreeding, but I know thin cows aren't profitable also. So feed is really a big deal. Feed is 50 to 70% of the total annual cost in a dairy and livestock operation. So when we're working with grazing and helping people make money, we need to focus on feed costs. And not only do we need feed costs, we need to calculate what's the cost of grazing. And this is really an essential thing that we can do as grazing planners. If we think about our moderate beef cow again, she's going to consume about 5 tons of feed a year. You think about that. I've got about 7 bales of hay here that she's got to eat, process, and poop out the back. If you line that all up in a line, that's how much that cow has to intake in a year. What would it cost to graze that cow for a year, assuming that we could graze year round? What would that expense be? And then the other thing is, what would it cost if we had to feed her hay every day for a year? And in I can't think of there's probably a situation where it might be cheaper to feed hay than to graze, but that's probably because they're doing a terrible job grazing. And and I've put together some really cheap rations with byproducts and corn stover and some other supplements. And we've approached a cost of grazing, but I've never matched a cost of grazing or gotten below a cost of grazing. And if you're working with a cow calf producer or a ewe flock, what we need are tons of adequate nutrition. Tonnage is really a critical factor, and it's the cost of those tons. And that's the struggle in Wisconsin is they want to grow this high quality forage, this high quality hay, and it just costs more. So we're going to go back to this graphic I had a few slides ago and think about this maybe a little bit more strategically and different things that we might be working with and different critters that we may be grazing. And what is it that we're trying to graze? If we're grazing a dairy cattle, excuse me, if we're grazing a lactating dairy cow, we need a certain amount of forage quality. So we're looking at, maybe something around 17% crude protein or wherever that line happens to be. We could either choose to wait until forage quality decline to meet that level, or we could feed pasture that's higher quality than that, and we could supplement with some corn silage or TMR back at the barn. So we've got a couple decisions there that we can make as far as when do we turn our cows loose on the quality of pasture that we'd like to have them consume. If our quality drops below our targets, those are fields that we might want to consider mechanically harvesting, or we can put a lower class of animal on that. Can we put a dry cow on that? Could we put some other class of animals that can utilize that lower quality feed? So what if we're feeding beef cows? Beef cows don't need the forage quality that a dairy cow does. We'd look at where that line might be. We're looking here. We're also interested in yield, right? We want more tons. We want a lot of cheap tons of feed. And so waiting for more yield and lower quality for a beef cow is perfectly fine. In here in Southwest Wisconsin and Northern Illinois, it's hard to grow quality too low for a beef cow. Now that might change as we get into Southern Illinois. I'll confess I'm not familiar with your growing conditions if there's some folks on from the southern part of the state today. And maybe that would happen there, but we just want to graze those forages before we get to that point. And when we do our comparison of cost per day per head grazing and cost per head per day feeding hay, if grazing is the cheaper option that improves our margin, then our goal might be learning how to graze more days per year and learning how to grow and develop a stockpile forage while also improving our yield. The last line I'm looking at is maybe we're trying to finish cattle on pasture. In this case, we don't need the highest quality pasture. We can get by with 10% crude protein pasture. And what we're interested in finishing cattle is energy, right? So in the spring of the year, that plant is taking this energy so it can initiate flowering and growing seed. But when we're into summer and fall of the year and we no longer have that demand on the plant system, all those sugars and energy continue to accumulate in those plant leaves. So if we stretch out our grazing time a little bit, we have higher levels of energy, and we can get a little bit better gain by delaying our grazing by a little bit to get a little bit higher energy levels in them. Now, keep in mind that we don't want to wait too long after we get into that third leaf stage, because we're starting to impact digestibility as we start to see dead leaves or dead stems coming on there. So we always have to keep that in mind. So a couple more slides here. And one is just trying to visualize what a grazing farm looks like. Often when we're doing managed grazing, we've got multiple paddocks. It's 8 paddocks, it's 10 paddocks, it's 30 paddocks if we're working with a dairy. And if we were to go around on a weekly or every 2-week basis and measure the height of each of those paddocks, we would have an estimate of dry matter that's available. And this is kind of a forage inventory. Now this year we've been really dry in Wisconsin. I think I've heard parts of Illinois have gotten plenty of rain, but we've been dry, and I've been managing or measuring some of my growth rates and plotting this a lot more closely than I have in some other years, because again, a little bit more challenging year this year. But if we were to collect that data, if we could put that into a spreadsheet, we can plot that out. We can organize it by what's the total pounds of dry matter per pasture. And we get something that might look something like this. And this is referred to as a grazing wedge. This is a utility app that the University of Missouri Dairy Grazing Center has developed. And it's a visual look at how much forage we have in each of our paddocks. And it also enables us to see, two things. One is our grass recovering at a rate that's ready or keeping pace with our intake. It also allows us to identify paddocks that have become too mature that we might want to drop out of the rotation and harvest as stored feed for another part of the year, or for a different group of animals, or we put a different group of animals rather than a dairy herd, which is where this example came from. So we'll see this. The paddock that we just came off of has got the least amount of residual. The next paddock that we're going to go to should have the most amount of residual, and that grazing wedge will occur across the entire farm. So grazing planners, as you're working with producers, certainly need to acknowledge that livestock needs change over the course of a production cycle. So we don't need to graze the exact same pasture the exact same way each time. We can adjust what we're grazing. Recognize that forage quality changes over the course of the year and the reproductive phase or not of that animal. And as we increase our rest period, if it's recovered, we do get more energy over time. Now, our goal should always be to move to the next best paddock available, or we can supplement as needed. And it's okay to drop out a pasture and harvest it for something else, or we can, at this time of the year, we should be thinking about stockpiling so we can graze well into October, November, or December, depending on where you are and what your winter weather conditions may be. But too often we are giving the next paddock, which is often the tallest one, but that may not be the quality that animal needs, especially for dealing with dairy cattle. So we always want to jump around to the next best paddock. Not every farm needs a lane system, but a lane or a way of moving animals is really quite handy to kind of hopscotch around the farm and get to those next best paddocks. So make sure that we listen and understand what your clients' goals are. What is it that they're trying to achieve? We've got quite a few farms that also have off-farm jobs, or they're retired, or they want seasonal. So our goal should be to design a system that meets their needs. I can design the perfect system for myself, what I'm willing to do, but if your client, your farmer, isn't willing to do those things, then it's probably not the perfect system. So I always start with daily moves are really good, but if they're not getting home from work for an hour because they've got a 45-minute commute, the odds of them doing that for any length of time might be pretty slim. So we need to have a little bit of flexibility here that gets us better grazing, that achieves their goals, but still does a better job for the grass. After we've helped clients build their system, we still need to do some follow up and teach them how to operate their system, because every year is a little different. One is hot and wet, another one's hot and dry. We have a cold year, a cold, wet year, and the conditions change. And so there's some follow up that we have to make sure that we do to learn how to read what's going on in their pasture and then adjust what they're doing to match these two changing conditions. And the last thing I've got here is this is a publication, Understanding Forage Quality, put together by forage specialists across the whole eastern part of the U.S. I think Don Ball is down in Georgia. Gary Lacefield, I believe, is in Kentucky. Dan Undersanders, retired, he's from Wisconsin. So forage quality is really important, and we have an impact on how we're managing it. It's available on our extension website. It might be available from some of your universities also. This was from Illinois, or maybe it's in Indiana or Kentucky or wherever you might be. But this is about a 20-page, 22-page book, but very handy in explaining changes in grasses and forages and how we can manage for quality. And finally, once again, if you didn't catch it the first time, email, phone number, if you've got questions, if we can't get those at the end of the day. So I'm going to end there and then let me stop sharing and see if we have gotten any questions in the chat box, or maybe everybody's left.
We do have questions in the chat box, and we still have a full room. So the first question is, how do we get the energy up on a pasture for grass finishing a beef cow?
So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to wait until I get to the 3-leaf stage. And then I'm going to kind of try and watch and learn about when we're starting to grow that 4th leaf and that first leaf is starting to die back and turn brown. I want to get it right about that time, as far as trying to get more energy into that diet. And then I'm also, we talk about, take half and leave half. We're really looking at that top half, that 50%, maybe 60%. That's where the best nutrients are going to be. When we force them to graze lower into the canopy, we're consuming more stem, more of those dead leaves, and that's what's going to reduce our daily gain. Let's see. I mean, that's working with permanent pastures or perennials out there. We've done a little bit of work with grazing annuals or cover crops. That's at higher cost. We can get better performance, but we also have higher costs associated with planting and grazing those. I think the key is one, stage of development of the grass, as well as making sure we've got my target is something between 40 and 60% legume in that sward, and then looking at that. I don't want to get it right away. I think we're grazing them. I think we're often grazing too soon. We're going back, when it's just getting to that 3rd leaf stage, and waiting a week or two would probably improve that daily gain.
Thank you. And the second question, does a longer rest period give higher energy levels in the grass? So should sorry, so let me start over. I apologize, Gene. Does the longer rest period give higher energy levels in the grass? So we should graze taller and rest longer?
So height is a measure of fertility, moisture, and species, right? And it's waiting for that plant to fully recovered, plus a little bit of extra time. When we look at grass dairies or grazing dairy cows, we're probably, if we're supplementing at the supplementing at the barn, we're probably grazing at 8 inches, taking that down to 4. As we move to an all grass dairy, we're grazing at about 12 to 14, taking that down to, 5 or 6 inches. As we think about grass finishing, just pay attention to that 3-leaf stage and not letting it get to that 4th leaf, or just grazing the top. Other things that I've seen producers do successfully, it's more in management, but for some folks it works really well, is come with a leader follower system, in which case, day one, we've got our highest producing animals out there. That's either the lactating dairy cow in early lactation, or lactating beef cow in early lactation, or it's that finishing stocker, and we're just creaming the grass. We're taking, if we've got 12 inches, we might be taking the top 3, we're moving on, then we come back with a second group of lower class animals that don't need quite that quality, and we're grazing a second day with maybe late lactation cows, or maybe lighter weight stockers. So there's a couple ways that we can go about managing that grass to get higher intake and more energy into that critter. The other part is to also think about maturity, as far as puberty. So early puberty breeds of cows tend to finish sooner and at lighter weights than larger frame or older maturity cows, or maturity types of breeds. So a couple ways that we can kind of get at that. So, I don't want to get into breed bashing or breed endorsing here, but there are some differences.
Thank you, Gene. We have a few minutes left. Are there any questions among our viewers who that haven't been asked? Feel free to unmute and ask your question directly. All right. Well, Gene, do you have any other final thoughts you would like to share with the group?
Probably just a rambling. When we're working on some different projects here in the state, and one of the ones I was working on this morning is looking at grazing dairy heifers and comparing it with growing corn. And we're not using $7 corn. I don't know how long that's going to last, but when we look at $4 corn, grazing dairy heifers on high quality crop ground is a pretty easy sell when producers look at it. I think, and when I've done my calculations, grazing stockers on high quality ground that could be crop ground looks like it's a better option if people want to work with livestock. I think that's really the challenge. We have to have folks that enjoy having livestock around some of the year or all of the year. And just learning this thing and trying it, and we're all going to fall down and make mistakes, and I think we could probably spend a whole program talking about all the grazing mistakes that we've made over time too. Would be a fun conversation someday. But getting started, we don't have to have every answer right from the get-go, but we just have to get started, and that's managing the grass like a crop. And when we do, we can get 70, 80, 90, maybe 100% more forage out of that when we apply some management to it.
Just a comment, Gene. if people think about starting up a dairy for grazing, and if you start with grazing your dairy heifers, you can learn all your lessons and make mistakes. It's not as costly as starting with your dairy cows. So it's always a first step is starting with dairy heifers. And it looks like in Wisconsin, we see a lot of people who are interested in doing that. And
Mhm.
even the big CAFO, big confinement guys are interested in doing that because they know that the economics is there, and then also they can learn the process pretty easily.
Exactly. We've got a growing dairy goat industry here in Wisconsin also, and their feed costs are just horrendous, and they're purchasing or doing everything in confinement and feeding. And I've got a couple that I've been working with that have been learning to graze their dairy goats. And we did exactly that, like you talked about, except with the dairy dolings, started grazing them post weaning. And as they matured and we got enough of them, we started grazing that whole dairy string, and the profit picture improved dramatically when they could get those goats outside and onto some high quality pasture. And so, yeah, starting with young stock um, is fine. We don't actually on a dairy animal, we don't want top average daily gains. We want actually pretty average daily gains, because if we think about excess energy that gets partitioned into muscle and then fats. Well, if you're a dairy heifer or a replacement doe or a replacement ewe, they might wind up putting that into their udder tissue, which then limits future milk production. So we don't want top average daily gains on a dairy animal. We want kind of adequate average daily gains.
Yeah, it all comes down to the goals of the producer, doesn't it? We have to, and that's why we're going to be getting into the grazing planning the next few sessions. And then now you've given us those tools, Gene. We can think about what we need to do, and the producer has different goals. What we might want to recommend as far as what kind of grazing system they'd use. So, you know,
Right, right. And from an NRCS standpoint, what are some of the resource concerns? I also like to look at, when do you currently have forage deficits? And a lot of guys are tight on grass right now. So how could we alleviate that? That's, alfalfa, red clover fits into that midsummer grazing. That's, I think, where exploring the opportunities with grazing Indian grass or big blue stem might be advantageous, especially if we're in central or southern Illinois. I think absolutely that's something to consider.